Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Lesley Gill. She's the chair of the Department of Anthropology at Vanderbilt University. She's no longer a Washington, D.C. dweller, but has traveled all the way here from Nashville to be here with us today. Her research interests focus on political violence, human rights, global economic restructuring, the state, and transformations in class, gender, and ethnic relations. And she's the author of what is perhaps the best book about the School of the Americas, which is simply called School of the Americas, Military Training and Political Violence. She'll talk to us a little bit about U.S. interventions that are going on now and what the shape of the U.S. empire looks like currently.
During the presidential election, we heard a lot about change from Obama and about how change was coming. And many Obama supporters thought that Obama wasn't serious when he adopted hostile rhetoric toward Venezuela, when he pledged to maintain the Cuban embargo, and when he supported Colombia's March 1st raid on Ecuador. This was all supposedly just campaign rhetoric that was necessary to win an election. Well, maybe. I certainly think that we're much better off with Obama than Bush, as I'm sure all of you do. But I think that the question that we have to ask now is the Obama administration going to chart a new course in Latin America, or will the United States continue to act as a destabilizing force in the region? There are some hopeful signs, such as Obama's recent decision to close Guantanamo. But the situation is not terribly encouraging. Obama's continued to use the antagonistic rhetoric against Venezuela that we heard so much from under Bush. And his cabinet picks have reflected less a decision to chart out a new foreign policy than a careful adherence to the status quo. So I think that without a strong push from below, we're not going to see a lot happening from the Obama administration. And there's a lot to overcome from the Bush years. However, I think that over the last decade, most of the progressive change that we've seen happening, and even glimmers of justice, have come from Latin America. Today, many countries are run by left or left-leaning governments that are more representative of poor people and indigenous majorities than at any time in the recent past. These countries now have more economic independence from the United States, as several countries are finding markets for their products in Europe and Asia, especially China. And the creation of the Bank of the South represents an effort to develop more regional integration. We also see a new multilateralism developing in Latin America, as evidenced by the emergence of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. We see that Ecuador has announced that U.S. bases on its territory will close when their lease expires later this year, I believe. And in Argentina, the Supreme Court in 2005 overturned amnesty laws that protected military officers who committed human rights crimes during the Dirty War. And by 2006, many police, military, and intelligence officers who had enjoyed impunity for years were in custody and awaiting trial. We heard this morning from Patricia that there are actually some who are now in jail. And both Chile and Argentina converted notorious torture centers into museums of memory to commemorate the lives of the people who died in them. The political shift has come about because of pressure from a broad array of social movements and popular disgust with 2 decades of free market policies associated with the Washington Consensus. And with several democratic governments now actually trying to tackle the problem of inequality and not just helping a few people get richer, Latin America would seem to be the perfect region to develop a new foreign policy based on non-intervention and multilateralism, a policy that moves away from the imperialist bluster and the failed policies of the Bush administration. Bush's reactions to the left turn in Latin America were uniformly negative. It supported coups in Venezuela in 2002 and Haiti in 2004. It funneled aid to anti-government groups in Bolivia and Venezuela. It adopted a divide and conquer strategy in efforts to separate Brazil and Chile, the so-called good left, from Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the so-called bad left. It authorized the torture of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And under the guise of fighting the war on terror, Southcom developed a plan for the next decade that identifies all kinds of new threats: drug trafficking, crime, gangs, natural disasters, corruption, poverty, and terrorism, all of which provide new justifications for U.S. intervention in the hemisphere. And I think what's most disturbing about this list, some of which are new suspects, some of whom are not, is that the so-called security threats dump together terrorists, drug traffickers, poor people, and victims of natural disaster into the same category as a threat, and then makes them all potential targets for state violence. Bush also dumped billions of dollars into the mostly military aid program known as Plan Colombia, which was begun under the Clinton administration. Plan Colombia, as many of you know, had less to do with stemming the flow of illegal drugs into the United States than with fighting leftist guerrillas in Colombia. To date, there has been no reduction in the quantity of cocaine imported into the United States, nor has there been a reduction in the area cultivated in coca leaves in Colombia. But under Plan Colombia, right-wing paramilitaries allied with state security forces grew more powerful. They pushed guerrillas out of many areas of the country, especially along the north coast, in an alliance with state security forces. And they did so by forging other alliances with regional elites and drug lords, and massacring and displacing thousands of people in the process. Despite their partial demobilization in 2005, however, the paramilitaries still remain a threat in Colombia, where a new generation of mercenaries continues to threaten trade unionists, human rights defenders, and peasant and indigenous leaders, basically anyone who threatens the status quo. And the scandal that came to be known as the Parapolitica scandal, which erupted last spring, is indicative of the extent of paramilitary power. Over 60 congressional figures are today either in jail or under investigation for ties to the paramilitaries, and all of them come from right-wing political parties that form the part of the coalition that supports Colombian President Álvaro Uribe, who is one of the U.S.'s few remaining allies in Latin America.